the just above. Those people who are just above the benefit threshold, those people who are just above the pension credit threshold, those people who are just above the threshold where you get a social tariff. In other words, the not helped who are very angry about who has been helped and that they haven't been helped by the state, who see lots of help coming from the state but they're not getting it. Those on low to low middle incomes just above the threshold.
Yes. What about the help with the cost of living this morning? It's VAT off electricity bills, adds up to £45 a year, which is a pretty modest sum of money. Yes, it all has to be paid for, but could it be said that the Prime Minister wants to demonstrate some empathy as far as that is possible in a quick morning after announcement? It will not be a game changer, could not be and will not be.
Yes, but Andy Burnham, he gave a small briefing to journalists yesterday in the Garden in Number 10 after his big speech in Downing Street, and he made that point that today's announcement he didn't see or expect anyone to see as a big game changer, but he meant it as a direction of travel. So he wants people to look at his government and say that this is one of its priorities. That's the idea. But of course, beyond that, there is a suggestion there from him that he wants to go further, and there will, of course, be more announcements this week and throughout the summer and in the budget. But I think, the wider truth is it's just extremely hard to find any money for anything. Keir Starmer's government looked at this measure, dismissed it, went for another way of helping households with energy bills. But the problem Starmer's government faced was that when they introduced their own energy bills measure, almost immediately after that, the Iran war started, and all the internal estimates, some of which we still don't know the full details of, but those regular Cobra meetings they were having, all of them were hinting at concerns from within the Treasury, from within Whitehall, at really bad economic news coming down the tracks later on in the autumn and winter. So I think the problem is giving a bit of respite will be welcomed, and it is the sort of thing, the sort of message that Keir Starmer was trying to land. Perhaps Andy Burnham will be able to land it better as a priority from him, but he still faces the fundamental problem of there just not being much money to spend.
No, indeed. Darren Jones sat yesterday. He was Keir Starmer's chief secretary in the cabinet. He joined opposition critics, in saying the cut in VAT on electricity bills, it hadn't been funded. It was marked as being funded by not spending money on an ID card scheme, but the details of that were not out there. Now, James Lyons, the former Downing Street director of comms for Starmer, he spoke to Stephen Sacco earlier. He was asked how he'd feel if he was in the role of head of comms if a recently sacked cabinet minister said what Darren Jones had said.
I think incandescent would be the word. They'd be peeling me off the ceiling. But look, the point is that some of the people who have just rejoined the cabinet or been promoted don't have entirely clean hands on these things. Some of them have departed government in the past and not always sought to make a success of it afterwards. So I think that's where the Starmerites would sort of be, making their argument. Well, it's a truism that every time you shuffle the pack, and look, this wasn't a reshuffle, this was Andy's first cabinet, but every time you make these kind of changes, you risk you do anger far more people than you ever please. That's why no Prime Minister does these things lightly.
So James Lyons, Anna, saying he'd be incandescent if such a thing had been said on his watch. It doesn't bode especially well, does it, for the spirit of unity that Andy Burnham's saying he needs?
Well, look, I think the point James Lyons is making can also be made about reshuffles more generally. So I spoke to Simon Hart this morning, who's a former Tory chief whip, who says that for every friend you make in a reshuffle, you make 3 enemies, which I think puts the same point rather pithily from someone who has done multiple reshuffles. The only point I would make about Darren Jones's intervention, and listen, I mean, MPs have reacted and ministers very, very badly privately to it, but I think by doing it so quickly, by making such a criticism just after getting sacked, it looks pretty petulant, and that point has been made. It also is being pointed out that it doesn't exactly cover Darren Jones or the former government in great favour, because they're essentially admitting that something that they were pushing is unfunded. But I think by doing it so quickly, as opposed to perhaps waiting a little bit, making a big intervention that could be more damaging later on, he's uniting people against himself more than anything.
Yeah, and very
today.
briefly, you're saying that you're hearing much more of the same, though just privately.
Absolutely. I mean, I've had messages from MPs reacting to Darren Jones, really, really unimpressed, but also saying it's mad, accusing him of undermining a government, which a lot of MPs, I think, there's disagreement and debate in terms of the appointments, in terms of direction, as there naturally would be, but generally the mood within the party is that they are willing Andy Burnham to succeed. They know how existential this is, and they know that they, having rolled the dice on a new leader and resulted in weeks and months of frankly instability and the government just not running the business as usual, they need it to work.
Right, Anna Mikhailova, thank you. Now let's get the thoughts of Martin Lewis, who's the founder of Money and a Money Savings Expert. Hello to you, Martin. Welcome.
Hello, you pluralised me. It's money saving expert, John. But I will try and do some savings too.
Money saving expert Martin Lewis. What do you think of what we heard on this, the removal of VAT on electricity?
Look, I think we have to welcome it. And I think that the first thing to look at is the totem. And it is only a totem. I can't think it's anything more than that. When the Starmer administration started, the first thing they did is cut winter fuel payment, means tested it, linking it to a benefit that should never be in the means testing. Pension credit is fundamentally underclaimed. It was a mistake. I knew about it slightly in advance and instantly said, don't do this. This is a terrible mistake. That was obvious. I think this is a good totemic move. And the reason I call it a totem, though, is while the government is saying it is on a typical bill, a 45 or a 48 pound saving, this 6-month cut or reduction to zero of VAT on domestic electricity bills, we need to look at it in the round. 60% of people in England, Scotland and Wales are on a price cap tariff. They're on their company's standard variable tariff, their do not tariff. Now, that tariff moves every 3 months, and it will move on the 1st of October when this comes in place, and that will be done on a 3-month average of wholesale bills. It is due to end in another 2 weeks. So we're nearly all the way through the assessment period. And it looks like the current predictions are that price cap is to rise by 3.1%. And if the wholesale rates as they're going on the back of the Middle East crisis continue to stay high, it could rise by even more. So you have a 4.8% cut in electricity, but a 3.1% increase in gas and electricity at the same period. So effectively, the rise that's coming to the price cap cancels out much, if not all, of the VAT cut. And in fact, it's thought in January, though this is much more crystal ball gazing, that the price cap will rise again. So at best, I think, for a typical household, this cut, what they'll see in their pocket of it is maybe 15 to 20 quid over a 6-month period, or a little less than £1 a week. But it's a totem. It's a thought in the right direction, and I think that's the most interesting point. I don't think anyone's going to be writing home about the savings in themselves.
No, I mean, fair to say, quite objectively, that we're talking here more about presentation than significant help.
Yeah, I think we are. I mean, listen, we've got to say that, you could look at it another way, and you could say if they didn't do this, people would be paying 5% more than they are for 6 months. That's absolutely true. But in terms of this isn't going to make people, well, I'm feeling so much better because my energy bills aren't going up by quite as much as they would have gone up otherwise. That's not how the public works. But I think it's a signal of intent. Right. And I think it opens a debate. And that's really important about what we do with the cost of living crisis. And there are many big issues that relate to that. You've got energy bills, many more policy costs need to come off. They need to get rid of the standing charge. There's a whole load of range. We need to get more people off the price cap. You've got water bills going up 35%. 10%. You've got the fact they have not legislated against mid-contract broadband and mobile price hikes. You've got the intergenerational problems. They're planning to freeze the student loan threshold next April. A nightmare, a breach of natural justice, in my view. And I would hope to see that this new administration cans that and looks at the broken student loan system and the LISA system that's penalising people in the southeast of England, first-time buyers, young people trying to buy a house. And then you've got the biggest issue of all, John, which is the one that people don't talk about, which is what I'm trying calling the just aboves. And I think this is the biggest thing that the new administration is going to need to tackle on the cost of living.
All right.
There are so...
Now, carry on, Martin, please.
There are so many people out there. And I do think some of the anger towards Keir Starmer, and I've always found the anger surprising. Disappointment, I could understand why people might be disappointed he hasn't done what they wanted. Dislike you can get in a politician. But visceral anger to a relatively calm man. And I think in my sphere, that comes from the just aboves. Those people who are just above the benefit threshold. Those people who are just above the pension credit threshold. Those people who are just above the threshold where you get a social tariff. In other words, the not helped who are very angry about who has been helped and that they haven't been helped by the state, who see lots of help coming from the state but they're not getting it, those on low to low middle incomes just above the threshold.
Yes.
And so the big question I think that Andy Burnham is going to have to look at when he looks at the cost of living is, where does he draw the line on who gets help and who doesn't get help? And I think it's been drawn very low in the past, and I think he's going to need to shift that higher up the income spectrum if he wants to get the political capital out of this.
Really interesting thoughts. Martin Lewis, as always, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Now, I spoke earlier to the director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, that's Helen Miller. Asked her whether the scale of what's being offered simply underlined the government's fiscal limitations.
Well, there's a few important pieces of context. One is that, as Andy Burnham has underlined, people are feeling the cost of living pinch. People are feeling that things are expensive in the shops, and he's been clear that he wants to help with that. But the public finances backdrop is that things are really tight. I mean, for context, the current plans that the government inherited suggests that although spending is going to be growing across the rest of the parliament, tax will be growing by more in order to bring borrowing down. And if the NHS gets anything like the kind of settlements they were expecting, you would already be expecting to see cuts to some government departments. That was what they were expecting to have to do. On top of that, they have a whole bunch of new priorities, including devolution, council houses, rough sleeping, and many others. So if they want to find more money for anything, really, they're going to have to either raise taxes or cut something elsewhere. Now, in that grand scheme of things, actually, what we heard with the VAT cut is really relatively small. It won't cost a huge amount of money. But given those broader pressures, it is money that's going to have to be found from somewhere.
Yeah, because, well, the criticism that we've had from Darren Jones, the former cabinet minister, and elsewhere, that this can't be called funded. You would agree with that as a matter of fact?
Well, I think the facts are basically that the government has said it wanted to fund its ID scheme, and it had told departments they needed to find savings to fund that scheme. It looks like the savings hadn't yet been found. So now they've said, forget that scheme, we've got a new thing to pay for, you have to find some savings. So in a sense, it is true the government is taking the pressure away. They're saying that departments no longer have to find money for that ID scheme, but it is still the case they are going to have to identify real, tangible savings to pay for this scheme. I think the bigger issue really is whether the new measure is temporary or permanent. If it's temporary, if it's just for 6 months, then they have to find almost £1 billion. That's still a lot of money, but worst case scenario, they'll end up borrowing a bit more, which isn't ideal, but is manageable. If it is permanent and they really want to pay for it, then they really haven't answered the question at all about how they're going to pay for it next year and the year after. So from the budget, they're going to have to answer that question. They've basically given themselves a new demand on funding they're going to have to sort out when the autumn comes.
And again, by way of context, we're talking about help with electricity bills, not gas. And with this form of support, the biggest gains go to the richest households.
Yeah, it's interesting because although the war in the Middle East has pushed up prices, actually electricity prices haven't really moved very much. We've seen much bigger moves with gas prices, with food prices. So it isn't particularly well targeted if what you want to try to do is help people with the costs driven by the war. It's also the case that, at least in cash terms, the biggest cash beneficiaries will be richer households, those that spend more on electricity overall. So if you wanted to help poorer households, there would have been more direct ways to do that.
Yeah, and given the scale of what's being announced, is it fair to say this is maybe as much or more about political messaging as about the impact on people's lives?
Well, I think Andy Burnham was clear that he's calling this kind of a bit of breathing space. I think he knows it's not the answers to all of the UK's problems. I think he wants to be seen to be moving quickly and doing something. I think it's in that spirit. It clearly isn't going to solve all problems. I mean, we're talking about a tax cut that for the average family will be about £25 over the 6 months it's going to be in place. That's nice to have, but it's not going to solve anybody's cost of living problem. The much bigger issue here really is about weak economic growth. What's going to get us out of this cost of living pressure? It's not keep giving temporary giveaways to people. It's really getting income growth growing more strongly so that people take more money home. They have more to spend on food and electricity and everything else they want to spend money on. That's not something that a government can fix quickly overnight. That's going to take many more years and many more policies. And really, my hope is that when we get to the budget and to the big policy events, the focus is much more on those longer run, let's really revitalise the economy rather than these short-term bungs to help people feel a little bit better today.
That's a valuable contribution there from Helen Miller of the Institute for Fiscal Studies.